Welcome to Grazing Grass Podcast, episode 120. You're listening to the Grazing Grass Podcast, sharing information and stories of grass-based livestock production utilizing regenerative practices. I'm your host, Cal Hardage. You're growing more than grass. You're growing a healthier ecosystem to help your cattle thrive in their environment. You're growing your livelihood by increasing your carrying capacity and reducing your operating cost. You're growing stronger communities and a legacy to last generations. The grazing management decisions you make today impact everything from the soil beneath your feet to the community all around you. That's why the Noble Research Institute created their Essentials of Regenerative Grazing course to teach ranchers like you easy-to-follow techniques to quickly assess your forage production and infrastructure capacity in order to begin grazing more efficiently. Together, they can help you grow not only a healthier operation, but a legacy that lasts. Learn more on their website at noble.org/grazing. It's noble.org/grazing. On today's episode, we are covering part 2 of livestock color genetics. It's taken me a few weeks to get this one out. Wanted to make sure I was accurate and didn't say something wrong. With that being said, I probably will say something wrong. That's okay. I will let you know. Next week on the Friday episode, we have our renewable energy episode. We had asked the Grazing Grass community to propose some questions to a renewable energy expert, and he's coming on the show next week to answer those questions. So next Friday, it's a can't miss episode. Today we're going to talk about livestock color genetics part 2. So first off, the main source I'm using is Dr. Sponenberg's let me look at the book again. Practical Color Genetics for Livestock Breeders. Excellent resource if you're fascinated by color genetics. Goes into tons of details and talks about multiple livestock species. In addition to that, I have a couple other sources I will bring up in the episode. To get started, let's do a little refresher on part 1. Part 1, we talked about there's 2 pigments that are produced in livestock to give you your color. You have Eumelanin, which gives the black color, and Pheomelanin that gives a tan color, which could be a light cream all the way to a almost dark brown. So those are the two pigments that we're working with colors in our livestock species. And a lot of times instead of saying Eumelanin and Pheomelanin, we'll go with black pigment or tan pigment. And as I mentioned last week, if you're really interested in that, Dr. Sponenberg has a lot of information on that and how it happens in his book, Practical Color Genetics for Livestock Breeders. Last week, we talked about a couple locations on genes that covered the main colors we see in animals, and that was the extension locus and the Agouti locus. And those are 2 places on the genes that determine coat color that's pretty predominant on our coat colors and not what we're doing. The main one is extension locus, and with that one for cattle, we're talking about our black, red, and our wild type, which a lot of times we call brown. So that's like black, like in Black Angus, red, like in Red Angus or Red Pole, and wild type, like you might see in Brown Swiss or a few other breeds. And I have a surprising breed coming up on that in just a moment. And then with the extension locus, we talked about a couple other alleles that's available, but not really of importance to the beef industry, but they can play a role in the dairy industry. because these two genes appear in hostings. So if you have an animal with hosting background, it's possible these genes are there. They're fairly rare, and you probably were selecting or looking for an animal with these genes if you have one. One is called black-red, and that's where a calf is born red and turns black at a few months of age. The second one is dominant red. It's a relatively recent find. And I'm including it with the extension locus, but it's really not a gene at extension locus. What happens if that red dominant gene is present? It doesn't matter what's on the extension locus. The animal will be red. So very interesting. It overrides the extension locus. And that's the only thing we have doing that right now. We do have some other genes that are modifiers to it that we'll talk about it. But it doesn't matter what's in the extension locus. That animal is going to be red due to dominant red. So there's the additional allele of black-red. So now we have dominant black, wild type, black-red, and recessive red. 4 alleles for the extension locus. And then we have dominant red that resides at a different locus, but is very important for the expression of the extension locus. Okay, so 5, one's not really there, so 4, but we got that 5th one over there. There is actually one other one that Dr. Sponenberg talks about in his book, and I don't know, I skipped that paragraph. I fell asleep during that paragraph. I ate some cookies while I was reading it. I don't know. I really didn't recall that paragraph till I was looking at DNA tests available for coat color. And UC Davis has a lot of tests out there that if you want to figure out if your animal's homozygous black or heterozygous black or wild type or red, you can send it out there. Well, my understanding, I don't know if it was that lab or another one, but there was a DNA test done on a Simmental animal that was red. However, the DNA test came back that the animal was black. So through more testing, they discovered another allele at the extension locus, and it's called red Charlie. And red Charlie looks exactly like recessive red, and for all practical purposes, it's the same as having recessive red. But technically, it's a separate allele there. So now we have 5 alleles at the extension locus. We have dominant black, wild type, black-red, recessive red, and red Charlie. So 5 there. And that's without considering dominant red that resides somewhere else that can affect it. So very interesting. It'll be interesting as we continue with DNA testing of coat color and more animals are tested for whatever reason that we might discover some more alleles there. Very interesting. The second thing we talked about was agouti. And agouti affects the coloration of an animal when they are wild type at the extension locus. Now, when I say they affects the color, it also affects the pattern of the animal in that you have a darker front quarters and they'll get darker as they age. The right and left side will look pretty symmetrical. When I think of breeds that really show that wild type, I immediately think about some dairy breeds, and that's Brown Swiss and Jerseys. Now, one thing I didn't mention a little bit earlier, there is a telltale sign for recessive red on the extension locus. That's a red animal with a white in its tail switch. And if you see that, you can be pretty sure you're dealing with a recessive red. Well, wild type in the extension locus has a telltale sign also, and that's a light-colored ring around the muzzle of the animal in cattle. So, for example, it may be a tan-colored ring, but it's there and it's visible. So if you have wild type in the extension, you're dealing with agouti. And agouti has a few different alleles there. One that's probably the easiest to recognize out there is brindle. And that's where you get your tan and black horizontal stripes. So depending on the color of the animal, you have those horizontal stripes. In fact, I have one heifer that shows brindle. Outside of brindle, Dr. Sponenberg says the alleles available in Agouti for cattle are not 100% sure, because they can provide such a range of colorations that it's hard to tell when one allele stops and another starts. So they understand a lot about the inheritance of it, but they're still trying to figure out the specific alleles to that. And Dr. Sponenberg's book was published in 2021, I believe. If not, I'm off there by a year or two. However, if I go back to Tim Olson's book or chapter on color of cattle genetics in 1999, he lists a few alleles for Agouti. Dr. Sponenberg doesn't go into those the same, so I think they're probably trying to figure out, more research is needed on them. But a couple that Tim Olson put out was a white-bellied Agouti, and that's where you get the removal of red and part of black pigment, causing a more uniform distribution of black pigmentation, especially across the sides of the animal. And he says this is recessive, and you see this in brown Swiss or gray steppe cattle. Another one they said was fawn, and it's the removal of red and black pigment, particularly red along the underline and along the back or dorsal stripe, resulting in a tan or fawn color. And that's recessive. One thing that surprised me when I was looking at his deal, a breed he listed was Limousin. You know, Limousines have that light red color. And of course, they bred them into black and that stuff. And as I mentioned on the podcast numerous times, my dad's herd started from a base of Limousin cattle. Well, crossbred cattle, we bred to Limousin for generations. So it's a very Limousin predominant herd. Or it was at one time. We're moving away from that now. So I went out and looked at the cows after I read that. And lo and behold, on those fawn-colored cows, you get that light-colored ring around their muzzle. I did not realize Limousin coloration was due to the wild type and Agouti. So in extension, they have wild type, and in Agouti, they have this fawn coloration. That's pretty uniform. A little bit different shades, but very interesting. But like I said, I can look at them and tell that because of that light ring around their muzzle. So very interesting, something I didn't know. I think it's always great when I learn something. There's lots for me to learn, so don't take that as I know too much. The other thing about Agouti, if you look at the colors in Brahmers, and I say Brahmers, that's always what we called them since I was a little kid. To be more correct, I probably should say Brahman. So when we think about Brahman cattle, if you go to Brahman.com, it could be .org, and look at their show charts, excuse me, the ABBA show color chart, they show dark colored animals or red animals and white colored animals or light colored animals. And you can see on almost every color shade that light tan or light colored ring around the muzzle. On the various darkest shades, it's harder to tell in both cases, but that's a good example of the range of coloration available through Agouti. So we think a lot of times we got that brown cow for wild type, and we have dominant black and recessive red. And that's how we're going to get it. But Agouti could give us a red animal. Agouti can give us a black animal, basically. It can give us all levels in between. So it's very interesting what can happen through that mechanism. And as we talk about other livestock species, it becomes really important in goats and sheep, more important than extension. So just to blow your mind, I know you heard this and later you're going to be like, wait, what? There are 4 different mechanisms for us to have a red animal, a red cow. We could have, just as we talked about, a red animal through the actions of agouti. So there's one. We could have the extension way we talked about through recessive red. We could also have a red animal due to red Charlie, which is a allele at extension. And the fourth way is through dominant red. So through dominant red, recessive red, red Charlie, or red through agouti, we could have a red animal, which is very interesting. 3 of those are really hard to tell apart. 3 of them. Yeah, my fingers, how do they move? 3 of them is really hard to tell apart. The 4th one through agouti, you can tell because they'll have that light-colored ring around their muzzle. Very interesting. Go look at that chart. In fact, I'll put a link in show notes so you can go look at that ABBA show chart. Something else that's going to be another allele that's not been studied greatly, there is a recessive black for agouti. So recessive black, now it's only been found in Icelandic cattle. So in Icelandic cattle, there is a rare allele for the agouti locus called recessive black. And that will give you that black coloration that you see from a dominant black animal. Just as a forewarning or as a tease, goats, black is caused a lot of times through that recessive black rather than dominant black. And that's one reason I say dominant black, because we do have this recessive black available through agouti. So very interesting. And so I just spent too long talking about the 2 loci that we had talked about in the last episode, but I wanted to give a little bit more information there. Now we get into the really fun stuff with cattle coloration. First, we get dilutes or dilutions. And my first exposure to the dilution gene, not that I had any clue what it was when my grandfather, he dairied, had Holstein cows, and a lot of times he would breed them AI to beef bulls. And they were bringing in these exotic breeds or continental breeds, and he was using them. We had, as a kid in my dad's herd, we had a half Charolais, half Holstein cow. We had some half Simmentals, half Holstein cows. And the half Holstein, half Simmental is where I first noticed the dilute gene, because that calf comes out of that Holstein cow from a Simmental bull that's going to be, a lighter red and white color. And it is a charcoal gray. I thought it was wonderful. And in fact, that gene, her calves would sometimes show that coloration. I love that coloration. So it's a nice dark charcoal. And what it tells us is she has 1 copy of a Simmental dilute allele. So that dark charcoal animal has 1 copy of the Simmental dilution allele. If she'd had 2 of it, she'd been even lighter. So I've always thought that was very fascinating how that color happened. Simmental dilution allele has incomplete dominance, and it gives us, in Simmentals, it gives us that lighter red color, kind of an orange or yellow color at times. Now in red, it's harder to tell, and Simmentals had that. But when you cross it into a black animal, and that animal is black, dominant black, and we have the Simmental dilution allele, it causes that animal to be a dark gray. And then if you get it, it has 2 of those Simmental dilution alleles, it becomes a lighter gray. And those 2, or that dilution allele, resides at the silver locus, and silver locus is home to a couple of dilution genes. So that is our first dilution gene that we're going to talk about. Silver location. We have the Simmental dilution allele, which we just talked about. It takes that black to gray and even a light gray in a homozygous for Simmental dilution allele. And then for red, takes that red to I like to think, a orange red, and then the next step is a yellow red. But sometimes in red, the coloration or the dilution of red is not as great. So it's harder to identify in red. The other major dilution gene that we have in beef cattle is the Charolais dilution allele. And that takes them to a really light-colored, almost white animal. And then in the homozygous state, it is a white animal. Its effect is much greater than what the Simmental dilution allele will be. Charolais can really lighten the color of the animal in heterozygous, while homozygous gives you a white animal. On the Simmental dilution allele, even in homozygous, you're not going to get a white animal. Sometimes in my area, I've got a nephew that calls these yellow calves all the time, and that's when you cross a Charolais with a red cow, and you get that light, really light yellow calf. He really likes them. If you do that on a black animal, sometimes you get that smoke-colored animal. But those are two dilution genes that are very important to the beef industry. Simmental, they've really worked to breed that Simmental dilution allele out, which I think is very disappointing. There was in the early Simmentals, and I'm not sure if it's only Simmentals, but some of that gray color was associated with rat-tailed calves that didn't grow very well. They didn't finish out very well. That has been bred out of for the most part, so you can use Simmental dilution and you don't run into that issue. When we're talking about the Simmental dilution, it's used in a few different breeds. Galloway gets its dun colored animals through the Simmental dilution part of the time. And you're right there. You're like, what? Part of the time? Well, in Galloway cattle, dun can also be through another way. So we talked about the silver locus. There is also a brown locus. That's another dilution gene. And in it's what causes the dun color in Dexter cattle. It can also cause it in Galloway cattle. However, Galloway cattle, it can be caused by the brown locus or the silver locus. So that could cause you some problems. If you have two dun colored Galloways and you breed them together and you get a calf that's not colored dun at all and you're like, what's going on? You just bred an animal with the Simmental dilution to an animal with the brown locus dilution. And those don't work together to do that. So that's very interesting. One other breed that we think about with the dilution, but they're doing dilution on wild type. So we're talking about dilution on dominant black or recessive red or red Charlie. You can also have that dilution play out on wild type animals. So for a breed that most of you can picture in your mind, it's brown Swiss. The dilution is similar to the Simmental dilution allele. According to Dr. Sponenberg, some of the alleles are identified in dilutions, but they don't know what locus they're at. For example, the brown Swiss coloration could be a dominant allele, which is similar to the Simmental dilution allele, but Simmental dilution is incomplete dominance. So there may be another allele at play there. But if you look at pictures of brown Swiss, you can see a variation in colors there. And it's where the Holsteins come back into play. There is another dilution gene that's fairly recent, and it's called Larsen Blue, and it gives a real pale grayish color animal that would have normally been black. As far as I know on there, they have not identified the gene locus for it, the allele for it. It's occurred in one herd, as far as I know. and I don't think they believe it's one of the dilution genes that we are aware of. And I say we as if I'm involved in that research. On the dilution genes, there's quite a few breeds of cattle that use those dilution genes to really mark their coloration. We mentioned Charolais. Simmental, not so much anymore. People have really moved away from that Simmental dilute. They are going for red or black. But we do have some other breeds like Murray Greys. And Murray Grey cattle are very interesting. That was developed in Australia and from a Shorthorn cow and an Angus bull. And then she had a couple gray calves, and they continued to breed those and expand the breed. Now, when you breed Angus to Shorthorn, you shouldn't have a dilution gene in there. But somewhere, probably the Simmental dilution gene was introduced, probably from the cow. And, also the other thing, Shorthorn, she's going to be red and white, or red. And the Simmental dilution allele does not lighten red greatly. So it could have been there and someone not noticed it. Anyway, they get a gray calf. It was repeatable. And I think Murray Greys have came onto the scene. And they are a fascinating breed to me. For the most part, they are homozygous for the dilution. So that's interesting. Another gene that would be kind of grouped with these modifiers of the main color are albinos. And albinos results in a light-colored animal with light-colored eyes. They are out there, but they're not very, very common. There is some thought that there is a chinchilla-type allele for albino, and it results in a lighter-colored animal, and it is available in some zebu breeds in Africa. Not too much is known on that at this time. For the most part, albino locus does not affect us in the beef cattle industry. However, the next one is huge, white spotting. Ken Cove Farm Fence is a proud supporter of the Grazing Grass Podcast and grazers everywhere. At Ken Cove Farm Fence, they believe there's true value within the community of grazers and land stewards. The results that follow proper management and monitoring can change the very world around us. That's why Ken Cove is dedicated to providing an ever-expanding line of grazing products to make your chores easier and your land more abundant. Whether you're growing your own food on the homestead or grazing on thousands of acres, Ken Cove has everything you need to do it well. From reels to tumblewheels, polytwine to electric nets, water valves to water troughs, you'll find what you're looking for at Ken Cove. They carry brands like Speedrite, O'Brien's, Kiwi Tech, Strainrite, Job, and more. Ken Cove is proud to be part of your regenerative journey. Call them today or visit kencove.com, and be sure to follow them on social media and subscribe to the Ken Cove YouTube channel at Ken Cove Farm Fence for helpful how-to videos and new product releases. White spotting refers to a group of loci and alleles that add white to an animal. So it can be very minimal to almost a maximum expression, resulting in almost a British white or a British white. That's how they get their coloration, where it's mainly a white animal with black points. So it's got black ears or tips of ears, black muzzle. There may be a little black somewhere else, but not much. But when we look at the alleles for it in the loci, because not all these alleles we see for white spotting occur at the same locus. For example, there is the spotting locus, and there is a certain number of alleles there. For example, spotting or Hereford or Simmental, they are all there at that locus. However, belted, like when it adds a white belt back to an animal, that is a different locus. So just remember, these are all different alleles, and they may or may not have different loci. Now, remember, if something's shared at a locus, There's only two versions that can be there. It can be homozygous for spotting, such as in Holsteins, or it can be heterozygous. And in the example of Holsteins, again, for spotting, that's recessive, so you wouldn't even see it in the heterozygous condition. If you have two white spotting alleles there, such as spotted and color-sided, then they're going to get an additive effect on your animal. So I've just mentioned a few alleles that's available for white spotting. Let's go over those. And there is a large number, and they can be divided into 4 groups. So we're going to go through them by group, and we're not going to take a deep dive into them. Because to be honest, white spotting, you really need those images, and with the audio podcasts or our videos, even the way we do them, it's not a great resource. But I do want to make you aware of the number of alleles available and different patterns available. If you want to see some of these, as we go through some of them, I will mention some breeds that display those. Another resource is Dr. Sponenberg's book. He's got photos of a lot of different colors, and it causes me, when I'm driving down the road and I see cattle with white spotting, I'm always looking to see if there's some of these more rare alleles showing up. Also, I'd mention some breeds. If you go and search some breeder pages for those breeds, you can see a lot of really good examples there as well. So let's get started. The 4 major groups you can divide them into. The first group has nice, clean, crisp, white areas. And when I say that, think about a Holstein. You know how the break between the pigment area and the non-pigment area is very clean and crisp. And then the next group is speckled, and that's where you don't have those really defined edges. You'll see this a lot of times in Corrientes, but we'll talk about some of those colors even more. The third category is roan, like you see in Shorthorn. So that's where you've got the pigment hairs and the white hairs mixed together. And then lastly, there is a category for modifications, and they modify these white areas in some way. So first, for the clean, crisp white. Like I mentioned earlier, Holsteins are a great example of it, and they carry the spotting gene. And the spotted gene is recessive, so to show it, they have to be homozygous for it. And spotted is one of 7 alleles available for clear, crisp white. Now, when I say that, remember, the loci may be different for them. So we have spotted, like Holstein. We have the Hereford coloration, or the Hereford allele, and that results in that white face, maybe some pigment around the eye, maybe not, some white around the top line, gets that traditional Hereford look. Then we have a Simmental allele. And we already talked about the Simmental dilution allele back in the silver locus. Now we've got a Simmental spotting allele. And this one gives you that white face with pigment around the eyes, or more of a blaze face on an animal. And remember, if these are present in heterozygous, it's going to have less white than one that's homozygous will. The next allele, Pimsgauer, it is very popular if you look at Longhorns. Corrientes are some that just jump to mind. They have that white top line, white, some white on the head, possibly maybe a colored head, but white along the belly with stocking feet. Next one's really common in certain breeds, and it's very recognizable. It's the belted allele, and that puts a white belt around the animal. The quality and width of that belt can vary. A lot of other genes involved in determining that, but for belted animals, they're usually pretty consistent with that belt coming through. A number of years ago, I bred some Holstein cows to Dutch belted bulls. So interesting enough, in those Dutch belted Holstein crossed heifers I got, I had some nice belts. I had some narrow belts, and I even had one without a belt. So, and they were all solid black with that belt. And you're like, wait, but I put belted and they get the spotting gene. Well, the spotting gene comes from hosting, but spotting's not available in Dutch belted. So you result in a solid animal, solid black animal. And then the belted gene is dominant. So it came over and gave a belt. Now, because I got one without a belt and she didn't exhibit any white, even if they don't exhibit a full belt, if they've got some white in that area where the belt would be, they're carrying the gene, they're just having a reduced expression of it. She had no white at all, so that means her sire had to have been heterozygous for the belt in Dutch belted, which is interesting because you don't really run into that a lot with Dutch belted. Mainly they're homozygous for the belt. The next allele is wading. So W-A-D-I-N-G. I know it sounds like waiting room, but it's wading with a D. And this is a fascinating pattern that when I saw it in the book, I'm like, oh, I want some cattle with this pattern. And the way it looks, they have white up on their legs, bottom of their belly, and then across there, it changes to a pigment. So they can be black and white or red and white, but the white's all on the bottom. And in extreme cases, when they're homozygous for wading allele, they may have even a white head with that. And I think it's I hate to say interesting because I say that very often, but I find it very fascinating. If you go look up some Loci breeders, they will have cattle with the wading pattern. And it's really nice because you can see some nice clean patterns, and you can also see some patterns that's wading with one of the modifiers we talk about later. The last allele in this category is the white sides allele. And in it, you're seeing an animal that has some pigment along the top or along the bottom of their legs, but their sides are white and they may be speckled. While the pattern is a clean, crisp white, they will have some smaller spots. It's more jagged than a clean edge, but it's not the speckled edge. And there's several breeds that display that. And that's the clean, crisp white. So moving to the second category, that's speckled. And with speckled, we have a few. And when you're looking for these, you might see them in some landrace breeds, Corrientes. I would check Piney Woods or Florida cracker cattle, or African breeds for some of this speckled pattern to see it. First one's color-sided. Now, color-sided is common in Corrientes and Longhorns. It looks very similar to the Pansgauer, but it's not as clean. It's more jagged or speckled coloration. Then you have fish eagle. And fish eagle is just cool because of the name of it. In a fish eagle, the animal shows more spotting and more white on either end. So the head and rear are more white than the torso or the body of the animal, and there's minimal flecking of white in that area. So interesting. Why is it called a fish eagle? I don't know. Good question. Spitting cobra. Spitting cobra. Again, another great name. The allele for that, it's kind of like you got spit on, and that white's right there in mass in one area, and then it speckles out from that area. So it's kind of interesting. Then you have Agricola. And Agricola shows a lot of speckling on the animal throughout most of the body. And Piney Woods cattle, you can see that pattern there, as well as other breeds. Now the Bororo, and I'm going to keep pronouncing this word. That's the way I'm looking at it, B-O-R-O-R-O. If you look at the African breed by a similar name, you can see they have white specks or dots of white throughout their whole body. I mean, from their face all the way, legs, body. And it's just really consistent throughout the whole body. It results in a very interesting looking animal. And then lastly, on the speckled group, we have speckled sides. And when we talk about speckled sides, there's white on the body and it kind of integrates into the other spots with speckling. I'm not doing a great description of that one. That one you can see in Florida cracker cattle, but also in some African breeds. Do a search, you can find that coloration. So we have the clear, crisp white, we have the speckled, and now we have roan. And roan's real easy in that our first impulse is shorthorn cattle, and that roan allele there works very interesting. You have a red cow, and if they carry the roan gene, they have patches of roan on them in varying amounts, and that animal is heterozygous for roan. However, if that animal is homozygous for roan, you get a white animal with colored points, and that's going to be the ears and muzzle. And like I said, some of these other alleles in the homozygous state, it can result in that British white look or that speckled park look. So outside the roan allele, we have 3 more alleles, and they have differing effects in the extent of the roan on the animal. They all result in, I think, a very pretty animal. I think roan is always pretty. I know, and this may be blamed on my dad. As a kid, we had a blue roan quarter horse, and obviously we named her Blue. I've always been partial to the roan coloration. So in addition to roan, you have Marucha. Marucha is a uniform roan all over the body. We also have Salinero, and in that you have parts of the bodies that are roan, mainly the head and the rump on the animal. And then you have the Pady allele, and in that, the roam areas will have some dark spots introduced back into them. I will be the first to admit I'm not giving you a great description of those. I do encourage you, if you find this interesting, look online to find some pictures. And then, so those are the 3 main grouping of white spotting we have. The clean, clear, crisp white. Not clear, but the speckled, the roan. And then lastly, we have modifications. And we have 3 of them. Brockle, ticking, and smudge. So these 3 alleles introduce pigment hair back into the white areas. So for brockle, they introduce small flecks of colored hair or pigment hair into the white areas. And a while ago, we talked about the weighting allele and pattern that you see in some Watusis. If you go look, you will see some Watusis that are in the white area, nice clean white, and then you'll see some that has coloration. That's going to be one of these modifications, this brockle or ticking that's put in there, that adds the color back to it. With those 3 alleles, brockle introducing flecks of pigment hair back into the white areas, and they're small areas. And as we continue to the ticking allele is flecks back into the white areas, but it's much smaller. And also, it doesn't appear at birth. It's something that will display later on after the calf started growing. And in an animal that has real extensive ticking, it will look very similar to roan. And then lastly, we have smudge. And smudge is introducing individual pigment hairs into white areas. I know for the white spotting colors, I went through that really quickly. And to be honest, a podcast doesn't do the white spotting genetics justice, because you really need to look at photos of that, and you'll be amazed at the extent of it and the different variations that can occur. But I wanted to expose you to it, and if you find that interesting, the book is an excellent resource. For most people, they're not interested in and the white spotting of their cows. They just don't want to own their cows. But I think the white spotting is really interesting. If I could play with white spotting genetics on cattle and still sell a solid calf, I'd be really ecstatic, because solid calf's going to bring a little bit more money. I think that's one area that the landrace breeds excel in. You get all these alleles out there for white spotting that you can try and figure out what the genetics are behind it. We're going to wrap up with that for today. Like I said, if the white spotting interests you, I suggest you check out Dr. Sponenberg's book. There is also Tim Olson's Color Genetics that if you do a search for, you can find online. And also Double Helix Ranch. They have longhorns. And David Hollis has wrote a few articles there that you can find. I'll put the link in there. He wrote them for the Texas Longhorn Trails in 2004. But very good explanation about color genetics and longhorn cattle, and it's a great resource as well. So let's just review them real quick, not very long. We have the extension locus, which gives us dominant black, wild type, which is brown, recessive red. We have agouti, which gives us some of those patterns that go with that brown, whether it's a light colored or dark color. And if you want to see more examples of that, hit up the ABBA Show Cattle Color Chart, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. Then we get into dilutions that causes the black color or red color or even a brown color to be diluted to another color. One of them is brown, which gives us dun in Dexter cattle. Then we get into the silver locus, which gives us the Charolais dilution allele, the Simmental dilution allele. Both of those dilute the colors. Charolais does it to a much greater extent. And then we have what's happening in brown Swiss, that they're not really sure what allele that is, but they think it resides at the silver locus. Then we have some albinos, and then we get into the wild, wacky world of white spotting. And I say that very endearingly because I do like that. Gets really deep there. For next week on the Friday episode, we will be talking about renewable energy, but we will have more parts of livestock color genetics as we talk about goats and sheep. Until next time, keep on grazing grass.